Good morning, everyone. So, when Lynn called me some years ago, the first thing when I was reading the proposal was that I thought we had written it ourselves. So, this is a good one, and it's in a sense once in a lifetime that you get this opportunity. And I think the other thing that really raised my confidence is that I did know a lot of the people also in the technical validation team, and I was very confident that we could actually take this on our shoulders. So it's been a pleasure. I was very privileged, let's say, to coordinate this with many other people that you will meet. And I'd also like to thank many people whom you will not listen to today, being our assessor teams and many other people from the Newcastle team and others that have helped us to sometimes very difficult situations. So just to set the scene, what we will do over the next 90 minutes or so is that there will be three parts. We will be talking about how we organize the clinical validation study, which is quite unusual, as you've seen, across these very different cohorts. We often live in silos and we don't talk to each other, but I think this project has been very different. So from the first day on, let's say we started talking and learning and listening. And then Brian will take over how we organize this massive, let's say, structure and the flow. It's quite amazing, let's say, how some of these analyses have been organized by Brian and his team, but also, of course, many others from Newcastle and other sites. And then Judith will dive into the statistics, and I can tell you the last weeks and months have been very, very busy. So, as you've heard, we selected, also based on the call, let's say, four very different, let's say, areas and themes. And let's say Parkinson's, of course, has a long tradition as a movement disorder. And of course, all our teams and cohorts in this group have been working prior to the project on mobility and digital mobility outcomes. But to bring them together, of course, also is to bring together different cultures. So very early on, we kicked off some work where we were interested to look at how regulators, in this case the EMA, has been looking at mobility and also the assessment of mobility using cohorts and potentially digital outcomes. And it was interesting, this was work that was led by Simon Jäger, who is a professor of clinical pharmacology in Germany, that to see that in some indications where every clinician's, every patient representative, every patient would expect that there are data, for instance, on mobility out there, there's sometimes it's little and there's sometimes there's nothing. So to make an example, on the one side you can see the New England Journal publication. And for instance, we've analyzed that more than 50 studies that have been looking at osteoporosis, 0 have been looking at mobility as an outcome, and not to talk about, let's say, digital outcomes. So I think this is an editor perspective, so no editor was asking for that. The reviewers ignored it, so the clinical trial teams did not look at it. So I think this is to some extent an unbearable situation, and at least from a societal perspective, it's absolutely clear that I think in most clinical studies we should be looking at mobility, because it's one of the core domains of quality of life. A very other important milestone was led by Ashley, and again, a very large team, let's say, was doing the scoping review at the university, led by the team of the University of Zurich. And we were looking at what people have been using. And one of the things, I will not go into the details, of course, is that you can see that Parkinson's, in a sense, was leading this field. And the evidence for other fields was very scattered, or people were looking at very, let's say, small aspects of mobility, such as, for instance, gait volume, or to some extent at pace. So again, this was, of course, asking for a harmonization approach, and that, let's say, we have a much deeper dive into some of these areas and what they can tell us for trials, but also, of course, for, let's say, clinical care, but also from the patient perspective. So basically, the mission statement that we agreed upon was that we want to replace potentially poor or incomplete clinical endpoints, that of course that we were very interested. Europe has many regions. For instance, our colleagues from Italy told us that they take care in Milano of people who live in Sicily or Sardinia, and you want to include these patients no matter where they live, if it's the Swiss mountains or some islands, let's say in Norway, that we want to develop systems that can be used. Of course, we were interested from the first day onwards to look for meaningful changes, and you will hear more about that. And of course, we wanted to increase measurement accuracy. And at least for me as a clinician, I think that when we started, most people were looking at temporal parameters such as step counting. And as you can see and as you understand, it's much more valuable also to include spatial information such as gait speed and distance. And of course, from the first day, again, we were aware that the discussion and the interaction with our regulatory bodies in Europe, but also in the US, would be difficult. But just doing this, in a sense, for academia would not be sufficient. So we started this conversation very early on. You've heard about this fabulous work from Laura Delgado and many others. I think what we learned from this, what we call a meta-ethnography, is that for many older people, and particularly people with certain conditions, that walking, for instance, there's a certain point in your life where you realize that walking used to be more or less nothing that you thought about, and that at a certain point of time, people have to spend some cognitive activity also to concentrate on the way they walk, and that walking was getting very different. And again, I'm not going to go into the details, but I think this is really groundbreaking work from the consortium that is showing that we have to look at context. That was mentioned by the first keynote, that walking, of course, has social implications, psychological implications, and that it's much more than just, in a sense, a physiological activity. So when we set this up, one thing that I would like to stress is that the technical validation study was fully integrated into our clinical validation study, because all the sites that supported the technical validation studies were clinical sites that later on also, let's say, recruited patients. So I think that was a learning process that was very well integrated. So we were aiming for more than 2,000 participants. That you can see here, and Lynn has also said that as in a sense, a subcontext, we were interested also in sarcopenia and frailty to start with. All of these clinical cohorts have certain endpoints that are very common. For instance, exacerbations in COPD, you will hear more about that, or for instance, care home admissions. It's a very drastic endpoint. Many people in old age will say they would rather die than be admitted to a care home. So these are the sort of endpoints that you would be interested in. And of course, we were interested in the predictive capacity of these DMOs, let's say, to understand what we can learn from them on the one side, but also what would happen if such an event would occur. So the clinical validation protocol that we developed together, that was also a very, let's say, energetic process, was that we would follow up people basically for 24 months. All this information is published, and of course one of the big topics is then how much time can you spend with someone that is maybe 80 or 85 years old. And let's say our study participants invested a lot of their lifetime to do this, and if we look at the people who continued until the end, it's very generous how much time and effort these people spent, and this will be also part of the afternoon discussion. So overall, I think we had a very widespread, so we could cover not all areas of Europe. For instance, we could not cover the eastern part of Europe, but we have a wide range ranging from Tel Aviv all the way up to middle Norway, Trondheim. And what is also important, that we have included countries that have a national healthcare system, but we have also countries such as Germany or France, where we have a non-NHS structure, because these countries very often take very different, for instance, HTA decisions. So then, of course, as everyone realizes, when we started, everything was ready to go. The pandemic struck us, and for instance, we had some sites, such as our colleagues from Italy or Montpellier, and also Barcelona, that had, of course, major problems, and then we had a very difficult discussion, but at the end we decided, I think this was the fully right decision, that the sites that could start should start. And another point that we managed to do, and actually maybe it was the best thing we could have done, is that we developed a series of webinars and remote training for assessors and recruitment teams. This is all uploaded and can be, let's say, assessed if needed. Then, as Lynn has said, within the study, we run into sensor supply chain problems that, again, was a problem, and it ended up to be, for us, a very good situation, because then we really went agnostic. So we used 2 different devices, and in a sense, at the end, we accomplished almost everything that we were planning for. So just to give you a few numbers, we did not fully achieve 2,400 because we had some difficulties in hip fracture. A lot of these very old people told us that they were so concerned of participating in the study that they were somewhat reluctant. That meant that, for instance, the mean age of hip fracture was about 3 years younger than expected. We spent thousands and tens of thousands of hours of assessment with these people. As you can see, we have many tens of thousands of recording days. The adherence, as you will hear, was very, very high, the willingness to wear the different devices. And as you can expect, the recruitment took longer than planned. So the bottom line of that is that at this stage, we can present 12 months data, and it will take some more time until the 24 months, let's say, will be fully analyzed. Thank you so much.